Hello friends, welcome to my channel. This is Abhirami and I am here to discuss with you about today's topic, that is dural venous sinuses. So today I will be talking about the dural venous sinuses. So let's get on with the introduction. Before we go to dural venous sinuses, let me talk a little about dural folds. So we all know that there are three meninges that cover the brain. These three are arachnoid matter, pia matter and dura matter. Dura matter is the outermost, pia matter is the innermost, covering the brain, and the arachnoid matter is in between them. So this is a picture of these three meninges. The dura matter lines the skeleton, and the dura matter has two layers, that is the outer endosteal layer and inner meningeal layer. The outer endosteal layer lines the inner layer of the skeleton. Let's say this is the outer endosteal layer and let's say this is the inner meningeal layer. Then the outer endosteal layer lines the inner part of the skeleton, and the inner meningeal layer will line the brain. And also the meningeal layer of the cranial dura mater will continue as the spinal dura matter. The endosteal dura mater and the meningeal dura mater are fused with each other everywhere except where there is cranial venous sinuses. So they are not fused when there is a cranial venous sinus in between them. So now let me tell you the definition of dural folds. Dural folds are double layers of the meningeal layer of the cranial dura mater. So they are double layers of the meningeal layer of the cranial dura mater, and there are four dural folds, that is the falx cerebri, tentorium cerebelli, falx cerebelli and diaphragma sella. This is a picture of the dural folds for you to visualize. The first one is the falx cerebri. So falx cerebri is a large sickle shaped fold. As you can see in that picture, falx cerebri is a large sickle shaped fold which has a narrow anterior end which is attached to the crista galli, and the broad posterior end is attached to the medial plane of the tentorium cerebelli. Here is a picture representing that. And the main thing about falx cerebri is that the falx cerebri is lined superiorly by the superior sagittal sinus, inferiorly by the inferior sagittal sinus, and at the point of attachment of the falx cerebri with the tentorium cerebelli, the straight sinus is present. Then going to tentorium cerebelli is a tent-shaped dural fold which separates the occipital lobes of the cerebrum from the cerebellum, and in the tentorium cerebelli, on the either side of the tentorium cerebelli, the transverse sinus is present. So the tentorium cerebelli is somewhere over here, and the transverse sinus is present on the either side of the tentorium cerebelli. Then going to falx cerebelli is also a sickle shaped fold which is going to the posterior intercerebellar notch. And the last one is the diaphragma sella. The diaphragma sella covers the sella turcica. So as given in the name itself, diaphragma sella will cover the sella turcica. So this is a sphenoid bone, and the diaphragma sella lies over here like this. It encloses the pituitary gland, and the stalk of the pituitary gland will come out through the diaphragma sella. Now going to dural venous sinuses. Dural venous sinuses are large venous spaces through which the venous blood flows, and the walls of the dural venous sinuses are made of the dura mater. The walls of the dural venous sinuses are made of the dura mater, and the walls are lined by endothelium. The dural venous sinus does not have any valves in it. It also does not have any smooth muscles in it. Then the dural venous sinuses communicate with the veins outside the skull through the emissary veins. So emissary veins serve as a bridge between the dural venous sinus and the veins outside the skull. The dural venous sinus will drain the brain, meninges and the skull, and so as you can see, this is the blue markings all over this area as the dural venous sinuses. There are totally 23 dural venous sinuses inside the skeleton, and out of these 7 are unpaired and 8 are paired. First let's talk about the 7 unpaired dural venous sinuses. So as I already told you, the superior margin of the falx cerebri has the superior sagittal sinus, and the inferior margin of the falx cerebri has the inferior sagittal sinus, and the straight sinus is present at the point of attachment of the falx cerebri and the tentorium cerebelli. So these three sinuses are unpaired, that is the superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus and the straight sinus. There is also another sinus which is unpaired, that is the occipital sinus. Here is a picture of the occipital sinus. The occipital sinus is also unpaired. These are the 4 main unpaired sinuses. The other 3 unpaired sinuses are the anterior intercavernosus sinus and the posterior intercavernosus sinus and the basilar plexus of veins. Actually, this is the sphenoid bone, and on the either side of the sphenoid bone there is the cavernosus sinus. Okay, but these and the communication between the 2 cavernosus sinus is determined by the intercavernosus sinus. So there is one in the anterior part and one is the posterior part. So this one is called anterior intercavernosus sinus and this one is called posterior intercavernosus sinus. So these both are unpaired, and likewise the basilar plexus of veins is also unpaired. So these are the 7 unpaired venous sinuses. These are, I will repeat it again: superior sagittal sinus on the upper margin of the falx cerebri, inferior sagittal sinus on the lower margin of the falx cerebri, straight sinus at the point of attachment of the falx cerebri and tentorium cerebelli, and then the occipital sinus, and then the anterior intercavernosus sinus, posterior intercavernosus sinus, and the basilar plexus of veins. These are the 7 unpaired venous sinuses. Now let's go to the paired venous sinuses. The paired venous sinuses are totally 8 in number, and of course they involve the cavernosus sinus. On the either side of the sphenoid bone you can see the cavernosus sinus. Then it is the superior petrosal sinus. As you can see, both sides have the superior petrosal sinus, and then this is the inferior petrosal sinus. And the sigmoid sinus connects them. So here is the sigmoid sinus. The sigmoid sinus is S-shaped sinus, so the sigmoid sinus connects them. And then this is the transverse sinus. It is also located on the both sides. So these are the 5 main paired sinuses, that is the cavernosus sinus, the superior petrosal sinus, inferior petrosal sinus, sigmoid sinus, and the transverse sinus. Okay, so I will repeat the 5 main paired sinuses again: cavernosus sinus, superior petrosal sinus, inferior petrosal sinus, sigmoid sinus because of the S shape, and then the transverse sinus. The other 3 paired sinuses are the sphenoparietal sinus, that is this one, and then the middle meningeal vein that is opening into the cavernosus sinus, and also the petrosquamous sinus. These are the other 3 paired venous sinuses. So that is the classification of the venous sinus. Next let's talk about the cavernosus sinus. The cavernosus sinus is a very important sinus. It is a large venous space which is present on the either side of the sphenoid bone. This is the sphenoid bone. It is present on the either side of the sphenoid bone in the middle cranial fossa. And so this is a cross section of the cavernosus sinus, and as you can see, the medial wall and the floor of the cavernosus sinus is formed by the endosteal layer of the dura mater, and the lateral wall and the roof is formed by the meningeal layer of the dura mater. So the medial wall and the floor is formed by the endosteal layer, the lateral wall and the roof is formed by the meningeal layer. And anteriorly, the cavernosus sinus is limited by the superior orbital fissure, and posteriorly it is limited by the petrous part of temporal bone. Anteriorly it is the superior orbital fissure, posteriorly it is the petrous part of temporal bone. Now let's talk about the relations of the cavernosus sinus. Now let's talk about the relations of the cavernosus sinus. So superior to the cavernosus sinus, above the cavernosus sinus, that is, as you can see, this is the internal carotid artery. This red color marking is the internal carotid artery, and this artery has to go into the sinus from the above. It will pierce the sinus from the above. So internal carotid artery will definitely be a superior relation. And then the other superior relations are optic tract, optic chiasma, and olfactory tract. So the superior relations are internal carotid artery, optic tract, optic chiasma, and olfactory tract. And inferior to the sinus, as you can see, there is only bone. So inferior to the sinus, only bone is there. And exactly which part of the bone is this? It is the junction between the greater wing of the sphenoid and the body of the sphenoid. This is the body of the sphenoid, and this is the greater wing of the sphenoid. So the inferior relation is the junction of the body of the sphenoid and the greater wing of the sphenoid. And then medial relation, as you can see, medially it is the sphenoid bone is there. Inside the sphenoid bone we have sphenoidal air sinuses. So we can say that the medial relation is sphenoidal air sinuses, and another medial relation is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is present over here, and this is the sella turcica. So this is the pituitary gland, and the diaphragma sella, which is the dural fold, is present over the pituitary gland, covering the pituitary gland like this, and the pituitary gland will give out a stalk which will pierce the diaphragma sella and come out. So the medial relations are sphenoidal air sinus and the pituitary gland or hypophysis cerebri. Then the lateral relations are the temporal lobe. Okay, the lateral relations are the temporal lobe, and below laterally, that means laterally in the below region, it is the mandibular nerve. The below lateral relation is the mandibular nerve, and you already know that anterior relation is the superior orbital fissure and posterior relation is the superior part of petrous temporal bone. That is all about the relations of the cavernosus sinus. Now in the lateral wall of the cavernosus sinus you can see some structures. Now I'll name the structures from above downwards. So first is the oculomotor nerve. The oculomotor nerve is the third cranial nerve. The second one below it is the trochlear nerve. Trochlear nerve is the fourth cranial nerve. Below it is the ophthalmic nerve and the maxillary nerve, and below the maxillary nerve trigeminal ganglion will be present. So the oculomotor nerve and the trochlear nerve, that is the third and the fourth cranial nerve, will leave the skull through the superior orbital fissure, and the ophthalmic nerve will leave by dividing into three branches: lacrimal, frontal and nasociliary. And the maxillary nerve will leave the skull through the foramen rotundum, and the mandibular nerve will leave the skull through the foramen ovale. The maxillary nerve will leave through foramen rotundum, and the mandibular nerve will leave through foramen ovale. So that is all about the structures on the lateral wall. But on the medial wall also you can see some structures. Only two structures are here, that is the internal carotid artery, and one more small nerve is over here, that is the abducens nerve. So the internal carotid artery is surrounded by the sympathetic plexus, and inferolateral to the internal carotid artery you can see the abducent nerve. So that is the structure on the medial wall of the cavernosus sinus. Going to the last part of the video, that is the tributaries of the cavernosus sinus. The cavernosus sinus has tributaries from the orbit, from the skull and from the meninges. So it gets tributaries from the orbit, skull and the meninges. Various veins will drain these places and bring the venous blood to the cavernosus sinus. So from the orbit, it is very easy to remember. From the orbit, superior ophthalmic vein, and then the inferior ophthalmic vein, and the central vein of retina from the central part. So that's it. Only three tributaries: superior ophthalmic vein, inferior ophthalmic vein, and central vein of retina. And so that's all about the tributaries from the orbit. From the skull, there are two veins. First is the superficial middle cerebral vein. As you can see, there is a big vein in the middle, that is the superficial middle cerebral vein, and the four small veins beside it is the inferior cerebral veins. The inferior cerebral veins will drain the temporal lobe, and the superficial middle cerebral vein will also drain the skull, and these two will drain into the cavernosus sinus. So they form the tributaries of the cavernosus sinus from the skull. So lastly, from the meninges, the tributaries are sphenoparietal sinus and the middle meningeal vein. The sphenoparietal sinus and the middle meningeal vein are actually paired sinuses, and they will come from the meninges and drain into the cavernosus sinus. So that is all about today's topic. Thank you for listening to me. If you like this video, please like, share, subscribe and comment on it. Thank you.